Okay, I welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. Why do we learn? What do we learn? And how do we apply what we learn in the real world? These were some of the questions I wanted to answer when I started this podcast. Along the way, it became something else. I truly believe that when you look at the journey of one individual deeply enough, the truths about a lot of individuals do emerge. So today, I'm really excited to have a conversation with a writer whose work I've really enjoyed over the past couple of months. It seems like I know this person before even meeting them. So, Rohan Banerjee, a little bit about Rohan before we jump into this call. So, Rohan is a lawyer by training and a writer idler by choice. He writes the More Letters, Less News newsletter on Substack that is about travel, humor, running, and books with a new issue every fortnight. His work has been published and featured in the Indian Express, Scroll.in, Times of India, and The Wire. And apart from writing, he's had an illustrious career in the field of law. So he works in a law firm in Mumbai. He received his law degree from NUJS in 2010, that's based in Calcutta. He moved to Mumbai the same year, and since then, he has been working in the same firm. So he's been at that firm for about 14 years now. From 2010 to 2021, he was a securities lawyer advising institutions and listed companies on financial regulations. During that time, he grew through the ranks and eventually made partner in 2019. In 2021, he resigned and transitioned into a part-time learning focused role because he wanted to pursue writing. So, Rohan, I feel like that's such a wonderful introduction, and I wanted to start this podcast before we jump into your career in law and writing. I was just curious about Rohan as a student at school. You know, what were you curious about growing up in Calcutta, if I'm not wrong? And what were some things that got you excited in school and outside school as well?
Sure. Thanks a lot for that, Abhishek. Very kind of you to say everything that you did. And very happy to hear that you've enjoyed reading all the Substack pieces that I've been putting out. In school, I was born actually not in Calcutta. I was born in a small town in Bihar called Purnia, and my very formative years were spent moving around a little bit, both in Bihar and in Madhya Pradesh. But the majority of my schooling and then my university was in Calcutta, so I kind of treat that as the place that was home. Um, Unsurprisingly, my favorite subject in school was English. I loved both literature and the composition aspect of it. Um, I also had an interest in astronomy at the point, but I don't think my science and my physics were to the grade where I could have pursued that with any seriousness after school. Uh, but schooling was good. I studied in a boys' school till class 10th, and then in a Kendra Vidyalaya or central school, as you know, they are all across the country for my 11th and 12th. So it was an interesting experience and a mix of both ICSE and CBSE boards. So got a little bit of exposure to the syllabus and curriculum and how it's taught. And interestingly, the way English is taught differently in the two boards, at least back then. Uh, I don't know what it is now. So I finished school in 2005, and that is when the decision to study law and join NUJS happened.
Amazing. Yeah, like in terms of that decision, Rohan, I feel like there's so much that goes into that decision because it's a 5-year program. And I'm curious, like growing up, did you have any family or, people in your immediate circle that had law as a career? Were there any parental influences in terms of you thinking about law as interesting? So I'd love to know more about that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and a great pick out because I do come from a family of lawyers, incidentally. My maternal grandfather was a lawyer, uh, as was my great grandfather. I told you I was born in Purnia in Bihar. So my mother's side of the family had migrated there about a few generations ago, and my great grandfather had set up a legal practice there. which then his son, my grandfather, had continued. Some of my grand uncles were also lawyers. So there was a tradition in the family. But there was never an influence either from my parents or my grandparents that I should study law. I never felt that growing up. It may have been a subliminal thing in my mind because I used to see them day in, day out when I was very young, and I used to spend my summer vacations back there. So I was very familiar with that life of law and going to court and then working late into the night with clients coming in. But I never thought of it as a realistic career option. When school was ending, it was, again, back then around 2005, it was engineering or medicine were really the two most popular options. I was clear I did not want to do medicine because I could not stand the sight of blood. So I knew that that was not going to happen for me. And like I told you before, my physics and mathematics were not really at the standard where I thought I could get a good rank in the joint entrance examinations for engineering. So I focused on what I did like, which was English. And I shortlisted a few options: journalism, just studying English honors. And law was really nascent at the time, by which I mean not the standard LLB 3 year course, but the 5 year course which national law schools now have made very popular. Uh, then there were a few law schools in the country, not as many as there are now. But really, there was one in Bangalore, NLS, there was Nalsar in Hyderabad, NUJS in Calcutta, and a few others. All of them had different entrance examinations. There was no central examination to get into them. And I think the year I joined, NUJS had not even had a batch graduate. It was a very young university. So it started in 2000. So when I joined is when the first batch actually graduated. So there was no certainty that there would be job prospects, right? Because it's you don't know what's going to happen, how people are going to get placed. But I think it was a combination of wanting to stick to something which is close to the English language. That was one. I'm sure the subliminal influence of seeing my grandfather being a lawyer also played a part. Calcutta was home, so that was another decision which fed into it. So I think it was a variety of these reasons. It was not something which was really thought through or programmed. It just, I would say, it was both many coincidences which lined up. And on this point, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, Abhishek, because I know you're an educator. Looking back, I think it is bizarre that people who are at that age of 17 and 18 years old are made to choose what they're going to do for practically the rest of their life, make a choice which essentially locks them in. Um, for a career path for many years. And now when I look back, I have mixed feelings. I don't regret doing law at all. But I feel like I could have explored so many other interests. I had an interest in history. Maybe I could have done something there, but these didn't seem like options there. So just the fear of unemployability and this pressure to get into a professional course, which is going to give you a job at the end of it, I think that's I have a lament. I have this lament with the education system as we have it today. That how is someone who's 17 or 18 years old expected to decide what they'll do for the rest of their life? So I thought of this and I was curious to know what you think about it.
Well, that's a great question, Ron, because I have grappled with this from a very young age. And one of the reasons I became a teacher was because I, at a very young age, started thinking that why are we learning what we are learning? When did this curriculum become mandated? Why are we learning these subjects and not other subjects? And in our school, also, sometimes there was a hierarchy with certain streams, right? In the 10th grade, for instance, if you chose the sciences, those were where the smarter kids went. And then commerce were where you would choose if you didn't have that. And then arts was something not a lot of people considered. So it was interesting to see these unconscious or subconscious hierarchies, you know, pushed down. And I think one of the things I realized when I was just doing some research about the history of universities in general, and I realized that the first universities that were actually created, they were actually guilds. They were guilds where a group of professionals would come together and their objective was to train the next generation of professionals. So the University of Paris, the University of Bologna, and the University of Florence were guilds for law, theology, and philosophy. Or, I'm not sure which one was which. So
Sure.
the structure of those institutions and the way learning was structured was, for 4 years you would learn with a competent professional, and then for 2 years you would take this knowledge and go and apply it in the real world, and then you would come back, and this group of professionals would ask you to create a product that shows your
Mm.
competence. So that comes down to that structure of bachelor's, master's, and PhD, right? But
Right.
in a more real world setting, I noticed that this was also applied to a field like being a blacksmith or being a carpenter, where your source, like your product was not an academic thesis, but it was, creating a table that people could use. So
Mm.
it's not a very direct answer, but I feel like universities, they answer the question of what you need to learn, right? And I think in the economic and social context you exist in, you know, there are several nuanced things in terms of what your family, for instance, prefers, in terms of what your own economic and social values are, that I think guides your decision of which path you want to take at a certain point. I completely agree. I think the 10th grade is not maybe the best time to make like a fixed decision. I think a little more time in the early
Right.
years of university to explore all these disciplines would be really helpful. And I think I'm optimistic about how technology can, limit those gaps and expand those opportunities to people from, from any background, like if they want to explore law. And I feel like that will slowly happen, where we will have people maybe look at different professions over time as well, maybe reskill over time, just like you did, Rohan. And that's what I wanted to maybe tap into a little bit, Rohan. Like you said, language was something you always loved, right? So did you just pick up books on your own, or was there, like, because I feel like language and law were like these two prominent themes in your life, right? So with language, if you had to go back in time, was there a book that really got you excited about reading, or you think that was gradual for you as a reader?
That's a great question. I can't think of a single book right now.
Yeah.
But it was certainly a gradual process over time. And I think credit for this certainly goes to my parents who kindled this love for reading from me for a very young age. I think the Tintin comics, I think, were the first things I read. In fact, I think that I got my first Tintin comics when I didn't even know how to read, and it's probably I still have that copy back home, that tattered copy where I would scribble as a toddler, and my mother would probably read out from it to me. The Tintin series was perhaps the first text I engaged with when I started reading slowly, and then that just grew over time. And yeah, I have always had this love for reading, and when you're young, I think that naturally translates into wanting to write as well. So I would try and write short stories and short plays. Um, Stuff that I would submit to the school magazine and later the university magazine. So that was always a theme in my life. And it was well known amongst my family and my friends that just give him a book for his birthday, and he'll be happy. So yeah, I think that gradually grew, and there are ebbs and flows. I think once you get busy and start working, then your professional demands on your time do make it challenging to keep up the reading habit. And perhaps we can discuss that later. So there were times when I was not reading as much as I wanted to, and my tastes in reading also have evolved significantly over time, especially in the past 3 years since I've become more serious about writing. But it is something which was always there from the very beginning. Yes.
Yeah, and yeah, because I feel like that's something I'd love to unpack as we, go ahead. And I'm looking at some of the books in your collection in the back, and I see a lot of common themes in terms of the things, both of us are interested to read. But from 2005 to 2025, I'm looking at this 20-year period for you, Rohan. You were completely I think in the later part, not as much, but at least the first 15 years, completely immersed in this world of law. And, just as someone that's looking at it from the outside, and I've had a lot of friends study law, I feel like it's such a beautiful subject because it helps you look at things from a first principles perspective. And, I've always been interested in history and history of countries. And I think if you look at our country in particular, the making of the Constitution in 1947 and 1948, and then how that particular document has helped, our country in so many different ways. I think those, conversations that the leaders had at that time, to set up this set of laws, I just find it so fascinating that you can have a policy, become a law, then that is applicable to people on such a wide scale. So as someone that's just curious about it from the outside, when you first entered university to study law, how was this 5 year program structured? What did you learn in each year? If you could break that down for me and you could tell me how your thinking on law changed over that 5 year period, that would be really interesting to know because I think a lot of law students would also be listening to this, Rohan. So, from that perspective, I'd love to know more.
No, sure, sure. I'm happy to do that. And I think you're right. The 5 year law course and legal education does cover a lot of ground on the stuff that you mentioned, which is important because while we do learn some of it in school, it is perhaps taught in a very pedantic way and you don't get into the real depth of it. It's not made real, it's not contextualized to our lives, and studying law can do that for you. So the first year of our law school was actually not so much law focused, but more on the social sciences, which is something that I am really thankful for now, looking back, because we got it. We got a grounding in sociology, in economics. We had courses in history. Then later we had courses in international relations, which are all legal adjacent because of course law does play a role in all of these aspects later, and so the courses were also programmed in that sense. uh, but sociology, for instance, I may never have sort of overlapped with sociology academically in my life if not for this legal education. So if I had, for instance, joined an engineering course, I don't think I would have ever studied it as a discipline. So the first sort of 1.5 years really is more of a grounding in the social sciences. And then later on, it becomes more focused on hardcore legal subjects. And there as well, you start with the very basic foundational matters. So you'll have your constitutional law, what you just referred to. You will have your Contract Act, which essentially is the bedrock of every a business agreement that happens today. So no matter how large the company and the size of a merger of two corporates, at the heart of it is the principles of Contract Act. So you study contract law fairly early on. We studied criminal law, jurisprudence, again a subject which I really like because it is an intermeshing of philosophy and law. So that was something I found really interesting even when I was studying it. And then the later years, the focus shifts a little bit, and you have a mix of elective courses along with your mandatory courses, and the electives are give the opportunity given to you to explore your interests. So again, some of which what I'm telling you from my time is of course a little dated, although it based on my knowledge interacting with university and students now, it's not very different. But the range of electives would vary from something as esoteric as space law to say a very specific niche of company act or securities regulation for that matter, which is what I went on to practice later. So it's a journey which takes you from the social sciences to the very core foundational legal texts, and then by the fourth and the fifth year of law school, you are doing somewhat more specialized stuff. By which time you are largely clear on what you want to do after you graduate. You could want to pursue a career in litigation, or you could join a law firm or a corporate, or perhaps you even want to go abroad, maybe study international law, international arbitration, or any of those other sort of different fields. So then you make the choices for the electives accordingly. That's broadly how it's structured.
Very interesting. And I think that grounding in the social sciences becomes very important because I think when you interpret law, would you say that you have to use a lot of theoretical references or ways of looking from these disciplines? Would that be right to say? Like you use some knowledge from these disciplines to understand and interpret law?
That's an interesting question. I am slightly handicapped in answering that because throughout my legal practicing career, I have been in a corporate law firm um, in a very niche space of securities regulation. So the aspect of the social impact of the work has been very limited for me.
Yeah.
Um, I would imagine it would be more relevant for people working, say, in who are litigating and doing criminal law, for instance. I can instantly make a connection of how a grounding in social sciences could help in a practice of criminal law. But even if we set aside the fact of whether it helps you in an appreciation of the legal stuff that you practice, I think nevertheless it is very important for people to study it, because otherwise it is left to chance that when you grow older, you have an interest in these matters and you read about the world around you and the people and society. Right? It is very easy to get caught in our bubbles of privilege and not know what is happening outside this little sort of circle that we have. Um, so unless you really make an active effort when you're older, you may be completely oblivious to the wider world. So I think this studying sociology and some of these other social sciences at least leaves an imprint on your mind to know that there are many real struggles and challenges that people face, which maybe some of us from a particular background and a particular gender have never envisaged or never reckoned with. So just because it's not happened to us doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think that was what I took away from studying a lot of sociology back then, and then didn't do anything about it for many, many years. It just stayed there. But later, then as my reading interest grew, I think it came back.
And like in terms of what you learned at university, Rohan, like, and even now, your legal reading, more from a professional sense, were there any books that really shaped or changed your perspective on how law is practiced in India that you would recommend for someone just starting off in the field, early on in their career? So, any book recommendations and any lawyers that have really shaped your thinking as a practicing lawyer?
So some of I must admit that I am not a huge fan of legal biographies. It is not something that I have read or been influenced by a lot. My legal influences really have been more practical in terms of people that I've worked with.
Got it.
Uh, but that is not to say that it can't be useful. I know my friends have, for instance, uh, enjoyed reading legal biographies of famous jurists and lawyers in India. So that is, I think, one avenue which people who are interested can definitely explore,
For sure.
because it gives you a sense of the person, and they also, when they talk about the legal profession, there is a grandeur to it, so you can see that. But the note of caution that I would sound here is there is this sense of grandeur sometimes associated with law and the practice of law, especially when there's the Supreme Court judge and very senior advocates who are arguing. It all seems um, uh, very elevated. A lot of the legal practice is not like that, especially if you're working in a law firm or a company. Then it is akin to any other corporate job, honestly. You will not be grappling with existential questions of constitutional law as part of your job. So the interesting thing about it as a profession is that it offers a very wide spectrum of things that you want to do
Mm.
and that you want to pursue, and you can choose which way you want to go based on your interests.
Yeah, and like in terms of which way you want to go, Rohan, like what are like if you had to break down the different fields of law that you can practice once you graduate from your course, You mentioned criminal law and the law that you practice, but is there like 7 or 8 fields that most people normally move towards after they graduate from a law program?
So maybe this will not be exhaustive, and I'll try and I'm thinking off the top of my head here. So whoever's listening can maybe just do their own research on this definitely. But I'll try and maybe before we get into the practice of law, let me perhaps talk about what is the next step after you graduate from law, whether it's the 3 year degree, which is the LLB degree, or a 5 year degree, which is what the national law schools offer. So once you graduate with the BA LLB or the LLB degree, there are a few options that you have. One is, of course, applying for jobs in the corporate sector, which can mean law firms, private law firms like the one I work at, or companies. It can be, you can also be ready to go abroad to either pursue a master's, or do a judicial clerkship, any of that. If you're really interested in pursuing litigation, which is what the legal profession is most known for, right? That people arguing in court before the judge. Then you can do that. At that age, most people join the chamber of a senior lawyer, and then it's an apprenticeship model. So you work with that senior lawyer for a few years, and you get the sort of hang of how things happen, and then slowly you branch out and make your own chambers. But it's a slow process. It is tough to go that way, but it is also rewarding in its own way, because you are actually doing the actual practice of law, of arguing and framing your cases and the points. So that is, so those are essentially the kind of broad um, opportunities that you have. There will be many others as well, but I won't get into it for in the interest of time.
Yeah.
Now, both within the litigation and the corporate job practice, there are various fields of law that you can slowly choose to specialize in,
Hmm.
right? So the usual ones are well known. There is criminal law, there is taxation law, there is corporate law, which covers a whole vast variety of things. So within the broader realm of corporate law, you would have banking and finance, where you would be advising banks and entities which avail of financing. Uh, Everything needs legal representation, right? There's infrastructure, finance and infrastructure advice. The coastal road is getting made. There's a law firm which is sitting and drafting all the agreements for the coastal road in Bombay, right? So there is a lot of legal work that happens around for everything that you see around you. So when we get into corporate law, the scope can be very wide. Um, the this entire space has developed significantly in the past 3 decades. So the firm I work in fact, in the 90s, they had a few handful of lawyers. Now we are, I think, more than 1,000 lawyers. So we have grown. So this entire industry has grown because, as you can imagine, after liberalization, the way the economy has grown, industry companies have grown, and therefore the need for lawyers to come in and help in deal making has also risen exponentially. So all of these factors have now made law a more lucrative profession. There are many more law schools now than when I graduated. And a lot of people who graduate from these law schools do join these law firms and corporates because there is a need for uh, this resource and talent coming in at this time. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, or if that's enough direction, perhaps, for someone who's interested to start thinking about it.
No, that's great, Rohan. I think you summarized it really well. And as someone that's really fascinated by this world of expertise and developing skills, I'm just really curious about it. When you are shadowing an experienced lawyer, right? What are some of the skills you are trying to develop as a junior lawyer? Like, what is the end goal of that process? And what are some things you developed in your apprentice period that really helped you in that career that you had, which you still are in right now?
So again, the answer to that really depends on what what is where you find yourself and what is the kind of law that you're practicing. So I'll answer that this perhaps let me answer it in two buckets.
Sure.
For someone who is say a litigating lawyer, which is you're going to court every day and arguing before the judges, the apprenticeship model and the way you sort of learn from your senior would differ slightly in terms of the skills that you pick up. The first, of course, is advocacy, the ability to speak to the judge, to hold their attention, and most importantly, be able to make a point succinctly so that you're not taking up too much time and the judge is not distracted. He or she is someone who's sitting and listening to hundreds of cases every day, right? So, in order to be able to convince them of your point of view and the legal argument very quickly in a very sharp way, that's what the best lawyers are able to do. So, that's the skill that you constantly, through iteration, you watch how your senior behaves and you learn from them and you pick up. And of course, their ability to parse documents, to find what is the exact legal issue in a matter, get at the heart of it, and solve for it, and use their wide experience to know that something similar may have happened in the past. How do we apply that court ruling or that jurisprudence to this matter? So that's the kind of stuff that you would pick up from being around your senior. A lot of this is in the litigation side. On the corporate side, it is, like I said, by its very nature, it is less of a pure apprenticeship because you join as an associate in a law firm. So you are already a resource. But of course, you see people you're working with and you learn from them. On law firms and corporate side, project management becomes a very important skill. Keeping clients happy, because they are the ones who are paying your fees. So trying to understand from them what their problem is, trying to deliver solutions to them. How do you communicate to them if what you're saying is not necessarily great for them to hear? So these are the kind of things that slowly you pick up on the job and that you learn from the people you are working with, from your bosses, how they handle these matters. And yeah, so I think it's a process of constantly evolving, constantly learning, to be able to do the best you can professionally.
Amazing, amazing one. And that piece you said about research, Rohan. Like how important is that in your job on a day-to-day basis? Because you also mentioned that some students may take up their master's degree and maybe take up a more academic path. So is that something you would recommend for everyone? And in your career, where you've been able to move to a space where you are now a partner at an important law firm in the country, like, maybe to ask you a better question, can you give me 3 or 4 instances without mentioning the case or the people involved where research actually helped you find something that you may have not found, without conducting that in-depth sort of study?
I, th- there are no 3 or 4 cases. Honestly, Abhishek, research is absolutely crucial in the legal profession. Um, there are very there are some cases where things are completely standardized, where you would basically just pick up a document, plug in the names, change a few terms, the address of the client, etc., and that you have a ready product which you can ship out. Those are rare, and even in those cases, the best lawyers will always do a round of research and checks to see if anything has changed. Um, because things are evolving, right, at a frantic pace. There are new laws which come out in our country. There are a host of regulators and who are issuing these circulars, regulations. You have the RBI, the Reserve Bank of India, which is the monetary and the financial regulator. You have the Securities Exchange Board, SEBI, which is the regulator I worked very closely with when I was practicing. You have tax regulators, insurance regulators, pension fund regulators, the competition commission. So, whichever area of law you choose,
Yeah.
there is a regulatory body which is framing laws around it, or the government or the ministry is framing laws. And these laws are constantly evolving. The actual act, as you call it, like the Contract Act, for instance, may not change. But there are always different notifications, etc., that circulars which keep coming getting issued. So you necessarily have to research on a daily basis in order to know what is the latest position and what is happening.
Yeah.
And secondly, as you sort of grow through the ranks, and especially when you are in larger law firms, which are sort of at the cutting edge of legal services, people come to you with problems which are often unique and sui generis. There has not been something very similar in the past, or there have been very limited instances of a similar problem in the past. So then your research is not to find a like for like answer from history, but to really digest everything that has happened around that space before and formulate a solution which is closest to succeeding. So it can be very interesting because there is this turn of constantly reading up, constantly being aware, and keeping yourself updated. So I would say research is absolutely fundamental, no matter which field, or like we discussed, the various sort of directions that you could take in your career after graduation. It doesn't matter. In every aspect, research always remains key.
Amazing. Yeah, Ron. Because I think it's been such a big part of your life, and that's why I wanted to spend so much time understanding it. And I feel like you have a very interesting way of explaining things because you made it very accessible. Like, even though I don't know too much about the field, I feel like I have a good understanding of what what it entails on a day-to-day basis, as someone looking at the field from outside. And you know I think it'll help when I'm speaking to other friends that are lawyers as well, because sometimes there are things they speak about that I maybe am not able to understand, but when I look at it from the perspective you stated it, I feel like it does make so much more sense. Now I'd like to jump into this parallel life you had as a reader and writer, Rohan. Like, as you were working as a lawyer, I'm sure your life as a reader consistently developed. So apart from reading, when do you remember writing something and putting it out in the world, and what was the first feedback you got when you put this piece, and what was that piece sort of about?
Um, so thank you for. I'm glad it made sense what I explained to you, and it was uh, not too scattered. Um, Yeah, so I think I don't know the first piece. It was probably in a school or a university magazine.
Okay.
But the pieces I enjoyed writing. What I can remember at least are the ones even at school. We would in our school English examinations we would get a prompt on which you would have to write an essay, maybe of 500 words or something like that. So I would enjoy writing stuff like that. There would be like write an autobiography of a cricket ball.
Mm.
And I would love doing like writing some, making up a story in my head and making the cricket ball like the narrator of that story and just write something. So I did that in school, and then in university also I continued writing. I submitted some pieces to the university magazine. If there were these writing competitions, I would submit stuff there. Honestly, it was never like I won any big awards or was received significant recognition. My friends and my family members would read and say we really liked it, but you know, Abhishek, how that is. You always take their praise with a pinch of salt because they're being nice to you. But I enjoyed doing it. I had a blog spot in university, if you remember, back in the days of blogging, the mid 2000s. Wasn't very active, maybe about a dozen odd posts I would have written there, but it was just another avenue for me to channel this interest.
Got it.
All of this really came to a halt once I started working. So 2010 onwards, I did not write at all. My reading also really sort of declined because, like we touched upon earlier in this conversation, and one thing, while I have been speaking about law in very glowing terms, a reality check I must provide here is that it is a tough and time-consuming profession. So whether you are litigating, in which case you're most likely working weekends as well, or you are in a law firm or a corporate job, uh, it is not a 9 to 5 job, right? Especially in a law firm when you are a service provider to clients, clients can call you anytime. And when the client reaches out to a lawyer, it is mostly when there is trouble and they need solutions double quick. So I realized that I sort of saw that through my career of how time became an issue. And I did not have as much time for reading as I would have liked, and then slowly I kind of fell out of the habit as well. Uh, I would read barely, maybe a handful of books in the year when I was reading much more before. Uh, so through that time, through that entire decade of when I sort of was focusing on my legal profession, writing and reading took a backseat. Uh, if I would sort of make attempts during weekends to do something because it was still there, that interest and that passion. Um, uh, but I was not able to pursue it for too long. And eventually, I think that is what pushed me to the decision to leave and really devote more time to it.
Yeah, and like, would you say, because I feel like the structure of how things happened, they align with, the pandemic happening. And would you say that was a time when you maybe got some more time to explore, other fields or other curiosities? And, I remember you saying that the things that you are interested in as a reader have changed over time. So, like, when when did you get back to reading, and what were some of the first books you read, or how did your reading sort of change as an adult in the last few years?
Yeah, so I can answer the second question first.
Yeah.
As I think, as a child and as a teenager, I read exclusively fiction.
Got it.
Um, it would fiction from Agatha Christie to fantasy, science fiction, anything, but it had to be fiction. I absolutely could not stand non-fiction books. That is the most significant change that has happened. I think in as I've grown older, I have migrated towards nonfiction. Bill Bryson was, in fact, one of the first nonfiction writers I read, and I think I fell in love with his work. And I was like, oh, nonfiction isn't so bad. And then slowly, because I had an interest in history, I have an interest in psychology. So then reading nonfiction, which is accessible and written in an interesting way, became more interesting to me.
Hmm.
And that has now completely flipped. Now today, while I try and do keep a few fiction books on my reading list, but it really always sort of skews more towards nonfiction. It's like a 60-40. It's been a 60-40 split in the last 3 years, where I try to keep at least 40% of my reading as fiction. But I'm reading a lot more nonfiction now. So that's a big change that has happened in my reading. Uh, what was your sorry? I forgot what was your other question. The pandemic. The
Yeah.
Whether the pandemic played a part. That's a great question, Abhishek, and I've thought about this a lot because of the timing of my decision, and I'm sure it did. Though it wasn't a very conscious that, oh, let me do something. The pandemic is here. I might die anytime. It wasn't like that. But so a few things that happened around the time of the pandemic. There were some changes at work, and I suddenly had a lot more responsibility. Um, and I think being in that space for about a year made me realize what my career looked like. I got a glimpse into the future of this is what my life will be if I continue being a partner in a law firm leading a team. And that uh, I think that was not something which I was happy with. It just didn't seem the right fit for me. Uh, so that is when I decided to pull the plug on that and said that okay, I have had this dream of wanting to write a very nebulous and ill-formed notion, but nevertheless, let me try it now because if not now, then when? And so that's how that during the pandemic that shift happened. I do not I hate people who say I have a life advice for you, and I do not want to go down that path. But just on this point, I will contradict myself and make one exception and say that do not do this. Okay, to anyone who's listening this, do not carpe diem and quit your job and say I'm going to seize the day and live my passions. It was a terrible decision in hindsight. because there is so much you have to plan for your finances, your future, your professional growth, right? You can't jump into things thinking, I love doing this, let me just immerse myself in it and everything else will figure itself out. Unfortunately, life doesn't happen that way. So I was immensely fortunate that when I did decide to do exactly this, what I'm warning against, my employers thought about it and then said, "What do you have planned?" And they realized that this boy doesn't have anything planned. He's just pulling the plug on his career. And then they very kindly said that, "Why don't you consider continuing with us in a part-time role, where you can maybe look at the learning and development and the knowledge functions that we are building, right? So use some of your experience to help that, and work part time with us, so you have some financial security and stability, and then do whatever you want to do in the rest of your time." And it was an immense privilege, honestly, to get that offer, and it was a no brainer for me. I said, "Yeah, sure, that works for me. It frees up my time." And so it's been that way for the past little more than 3 years now. And I realize now how important it is to have a, whether a full time or a part time job, but something solid that you can rely on and pursue your passion on the side. Because jumping into something otherwise is not something advisable at all. So yeah.
No, I think that's great. I mean, thank you for being so honest, Rohan. I feel like it's hard to reflect on your own experience and, be completely open and vulnerable about the things that worked for you and didn't work for you. And I think sometimes when we look at things from the outside, it does seem like there's a very streamlined path, but
Yeah.
like it's not always as, linear. And I think there's a lot of messiness that we can't often communicate through the regular ways we talk about our professional and personal lives, right? So I feel like that is really interesting. And I think it also speaks to your value to the firm, right? You were there for about 10 years or 11 years before you took this decision. And I think it would be hard for them to replicate the exact experiences that you had in that time with a new candidate or a new employee, which is why I feel they valued your time. So I'm sure it's a, mutual reciprocal sort of bond over there. And like I've read many of your pieces, to be honest, like not only on Substack, but I know you also have a link tree where you've linked out pieces you've written in the Indian Express. I read the piece where you spoke about a trip to, I'm not sure if it was Sikkim or another place where it was more of a travel piece. And what I
Yeah.
what I notice is there is this sort of element of the personal essay, like narrative nonfiction, and like writers like Bill Bryson or David Sedaris, and I see elements of how that sort of way of talking about the world, through using your own experience as an avenue to talk about something larger. And even your Substack pieces, some of them are very amusing, like the piece you wrote about gym music and like that environment. I feel like it's something I never thought about, but after reading your piece, when I went back to the gym, I'm like, I really think it made a lot of sense. I was like, I feel like you have this skill in articulating the things we normally don't articulate through your observation of a personal experience. So before, like, we can talk about some of your pieces, but like there were some narrative nonfiction books that really shaped my love for this particular genre. For instance, Born to Run, like the book that's on your shelf, I thought the way the author like sort of structured that narrative. The reason I'm mentioning this, Rohan, is because I'd love to know if there were one or two nonfiction books that maybe you really enjoyed and would recommend, and what did you like about it in particular? Like for me, it was Born to Run. There's another book called Chasing New Horizons, which is about how humans sent the first satellite to Pluto. And there's another book called Romanovs by Simon Sebag Montefiore, that's about the family that ruled Russia for 300 years.
Right.
Reading that book sort of gave me a glimpse of the world at that point of time, but also showed me so much about socialism, communism, where that arose in Russia. So, like, what was a book that made that shift for you? Like, I mean, maybe not even a shift, that you really enjoyed something about that book and it maybe helped you appreciate writing a lot more?
No, sure. I
Like we could speak
it's
about reading if that, I mean, like running. I'm sorry, I know that's something that you enjoy. So
Yes, so that's a subgenre that is very interesting to me. And yeah, I've uh, read some of the running related books. Obviously, On to Run is right up there, and Murakami's semi autobiographical book also is one of the ones which are very famous. Shohini Chattopadhyay has this book called Day I Became a Runner. That's also very good, and it traces almost a feminist history of India through the lens of sport and running. So that's one book I can recommend, which is great, which I thought was really interesting. But just to take a step back, I'm thinking about this question. It's a really interesting one. I am not sure if I can put my finger on one specific book which made this shift for me. I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier of just moving from reading fiction to non-fiction, and I think I would credit Bill Bryson for helping me make that shift and making me see that nonfiction writing can be thoroughly entertaining and amusing and funny and interesting. And share information. His book, A Short History of Nearly Everything, I think it's called, which is just full of fascinating details and trivia. And he is such a masterful storyteller. He's so funny. So he, I think, was one of the first writers whom I read in nonfiction and realized that it is a format which does appeal to me. Uh, Before that, the kind of writing that I loved. The first name that comes to mind is Woodhouse. I have loved Woodhouse since I was in high school and then university. I've devoured his Bertie and Wooster series and a lot of other stuff. But Bertie and Jeeves series is right up there. So Woodhouse is a huge favorite of mine. Vikram Seth, um, Agatha Christie. I would read Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot novels by the dozen. I think I read the entire Hercule Poirot series. So it was eclectic, but it was mostly fiction, right? So that's what I would focus on. Bill Bryson made me see that nonfiction could also be interesting. Uh, and then in the past 3 years, I guess it's been almost like a give and take because I am writing more nonfiction. I want to read more people who are good at it and learn the craft from them. And David, you mentioned David Sedaris, and I was so happy because he is one of my absolute favorites now. I would read a grocery list if it was written by David Sedaris. He is such an incredible talent. Pico Iyer in travel writing is again one of my favorites. Saman Subramaniam, I've read a couple of his books. Following Fish is a travel book that he has. Just great writing and just reading Alain de Botton. He has books on philosophy, psychology, and travel as well. And just a fabulous writer. The kind of prose that he has, so beautiful. So I think just it's been a process. It's not been a switch, but a slow process of realizing that there are these great people writing nonfiction. Uh, and I think now, like I said earlier, right, it's become that I am just so interested in reading their work and discovering newer people like them that I'm sort of skewing away from fiction a little bit. Um, Although there is this, I read this book recently by Nora Ephron, and there was this great quote in it, I think by E.L. Doctorow, if I remember correctly, where essentially I don't remember the exact words of the quote, but the point was that there is no difference between fiction and non-fiction. It is about narrative storytelling, and that really spoke to me, and I think that kind of summarized the way I also enjoy reading and the way I hope to write, that the form shouldn't matter, or whether it's a fiction in a particular genre or non-fiction. It should just tell a story that is captivating and interesting. So that's what I love reading, and that's what's informed my reading decisions throughout. It's just incidental that now it happens to be non-fiction because I like the narrative style that some of these guys I named use.
correct. I feel like it's nice that you're so open and so curious about your reading and writing life. I feel like that definitely gives you an advantage to bring in new influences, not only as a writer but also as a reader. Because I feel like all good writers are, very unique readers, and I've noticed that they have their own way of reading things. I'd love to talk to you about your newsletter, Rohan. Like more letters, less news. Like without jumping into any of it, like if you could just tell us why did you start the newsletter? I know you've written for newspapers and magazines before that, but what's your focus with this newsletter, and why Substack in particular? And what's your experience been up to now?
Sure. So actually, Abhishek, it's the other way around. I started the newsletter first.
Oh,
I started it exactly a month after I quit my earlier job. So it was, in a nutshell, it was meant to be a writing gym. I just wanted to have a place where I could write regularly, and I did not want it to be just a personal diary or a journal, because I wanted to hold myself accountable to, at that point, the five people who were reading my newsletter. I wanted to hold myself accountable to those five people, that they expect an issue to come to them periodically, and so I have to deliver. That was the entire thinking of it. I did not think beyond that what the newsletter would do. Uh, and now, yeah, so it's been 3+ years of doing that. I started as a weekly newsletter, so I did weekly for the first year. I realized it's very difficult to keep up that cadence. So I switched to a fortnightly model, which I have continued. So every 2 weeks, I put out an issue, and I'm I I am proud of the fact that I have not missed a deadline, because it is self sort of imposed. But that is something that I sort of value a lot. That I will not miss a deadline unless I'm traveling, and I'm absolutely unable to adjust my travel dates in a way that I can still put out an issue. I try and make it stick. And I think, the compounding effect, right? Like, because I have been able to do it for 3 years, it is now a non-negotiable for me that the newsletter has to go out. I have to think of something and write something. And it is incredible the amount I have learned just from doing it consistently from 3 years, and reading, and the way, the directions that it has pushed me to in reading. So yeah, I think I'll stop there. But that's it. It had very humble beginnings as just a place where I wanted to write whatever I wanted.
yeah, and for the listeners tuning in, I feel like I will link Rohan's newsletter and his website where he's put out links of other pieces he's written. I feel like that would be a better way to engage with those pieces, is to actually read them and share your thoughts about that. And I subscribe to the newsletter. I'd highly recommend reading and enjoying a few pieces. I feel like that's what's nice about Substack, is without too much of a commitment, you're allowed to enter another person's world, and then you can slowly engage with it more. So yeah, and for the last question, Rohan, this is just a digression. I know you have this image on Twitter about you, with your finger outside, and so let's end with that. Tell me more about this image and who the other character is and why that image.
Yeah, so it is. I think because you've read my newsletter, and I think humor has been something which I have always enjoyed reading. Therefore, Woodhouse and Bill Bryson and David Sedaris, all of whose works broadly, I think if you were to draw a set, humor would be the big bold letter there. So it's the usual story of that, something that I enjoy reading. I want that reflected in my writing. That picture in particular, it's from the Sistine Chapel, of course, and I have been placed in there instead of Adam. It was taken very funnily in office. A friend of mine, a colleague, she had taken that picture of me pointing at something, and it is entirely her creation. I can take no credit for it. Uh, I was merely posing for something, and she took that photograph, and it reminded her of the mural from the Sistine Chapel, and then she pulled it out and she photoshopped me into it, and I loved it so much that I just said that it has to be everywhere. This is a great piece of work, and it fits right into that picture somehow. So yeah, so I that's how I managed to put myself into Michelangelo's masterpiece, and that's why I've been using that little picture uh, on a lot of places. Actually, it's on my newsletter as well. Yes.
And on that light note, we come to the end of this episode. Rohan, thank you again for making time for this. For the listeners tuning in, I will be linking Rohan's Substack, which I highly recommend. He's also available on LinkedIn and Twitter, so it's very hard to, you know, talk about a person's journey, but also go into, the depth that I think, because I feel like I can talk to you for hours about your story and the way you write. And I'm just curious as a writer and reader, but also as someone looking in and someone that really appreciates the work you put out into the world. So, yeah, and until next time, Rowan, any last thoughts before we close?
No, not really, except maybe unless we're going really over time, just a small point to talk about the community aspect of writing that I have now discovered, and really what has put you and me in touch, Abhishek. Uh, that has just been fascinating for me to discover this entire new world. I did Amit Verma's clear writing course, and I know you've spoken to Utsav, who is also an alumni. Uh, Utsav's work is very inspirational, and that community that Amit has created has been such a godsend for people like us who are trying out something new and writing or creating or doing anything else. And really, Substack as well, right? Like you mentioned, it is so great finding new people on Substack who are writing, discovering them, learning a little bit about them, feeling like you know them. They are almost a parasocial friend because you're reading about them. So yeah, I just wanted to make the point that this community aspect of writing, which I have discovered through Substack and through the clear writing community and these other groups that I have since joined in the last few years, has been a real boon. So that has been a really rewarding experience too.
Wonderful. And I will link the course that you mentioned. I highly recommend that podcast too. The reason I started this podcast, Rohan, was also because I heard the seen and unseen, and I just love
Right.
the way conversations happen. And I think there's a beauty in the long form conversation without that defined structure. And I think there is a beauty in the writing community that's growing on these digital platforms. I think sometimes we give technology a lot of flack for how it takes our time and takes our attention. But I think there is a beauty to it as well, where without meeting people, you are able to be part of their lives in small ways, right? And even connect.
Absolutely.
Like we've never met in person, but we still are able to build a bond through words. And so I agree. I completely agree with what you said. And thank you again, Rohan. And for the listeners tuning in, until next time, stay tuned for more such stories of young people in India, building and creating their own careers. And until next time, keep learning.